welcome to Varn Blog. And in our long series on eco-socialism, I have Leigh Phillips and Matt Huber here to talk about Kohei Saito's recent writings on degrowth socialism. We're going to be picking up on an article you two wrote for Jacobin called Kohei Saito's Start from Scratch Degrowth Communism. And we're going to kind of parse the claims of Saito. I have been going through Karl Marx's eco-socialism pretty much word for word over on Patreon. And I have found myself starting sympathetic and ending in screaming at the book.
That's a good way to put it. It starts really well.
Yeah, it starts like a good work of Marxology. And then I think about 150 pages in the book, Saito just asserts that Marx means the opposite of what he even said in the letter that he's citing, and things go on from there.
Well, that's the prize-winning book, and from my perspective, there's 3 books now, and it's the most serious, and it's almost entirely Marxological. Maybe the problem is the latter 2 books try to get into some political claims and prescriptions, but I think the main point of the book is that Marx started to take sort of natural limits seriously, and I think he makes a pretty good case that Marx was starting to grapple with those limits, but he never mentions in that particular book that the limits that he was concerned with were of soil fertility, and those limits were completely surpassed by the advent of nitrogen fertilizer, chemical fertilizer production a few decades after Marx died, which just shot through all those limits that perhaps Marx was grappling with. Liebig certainly identified, but as we say in the article, came up with solutions to as well, or at least pointed to that we can solve these with fertilizers. But that seems to be the main point. It's much less sort of bold and ambitious a claim that Marx was a degrowther. It's just that he's starting to think about limits, right? It's a very different type of claim.
Yeah. I read Saito's edited volume on Engels and some of his essays in there, and I realized he starts talking about crisis theory, but he reappropriates what the meaning of crisis theory is from economic cycle crisis and the business cycle into the ecological cycle. And when I saw that, I was like, you can't do that seriously. That's a total equivocation of the word crisis. So I find it interesting that he starts strong. The first book is based on MAGA 2 research, or Mega 2 research. For those of you who don't know, that's Mega. I'm Southern. All vowels are the same to me. But anyway, the Mega 2 research. But I have found even that book. I agree with you. It was a pretty daunting and interesting work of Marxist scholarship. But the central claim that the entirety of capital is really about soil erosion and productivity seems to be a stretch, and we're off to the races from there.
A lot of this stuff, the Marxology is really weak in terms of its evidentiary basis. He's sort of extending or trying to extend John Bellamy Foster's and company's sort of work, claiming that Marx had a theory of metabolic rift. And that itself is, and again, that's another work that, Marx's ecology, John Bellamy Foster, is one that starts up really well. But the evidentiary basis for these claims are very, very thin on the ground. You've got a couple of footnotes in the 3rd volume of Capital with Saito. You've got the Zasulich letter, or actually just one draft, the final draft of it was a final draft, right? Of the Zasulich letter. Compared to this, this gargantuan canon of texts, both from Marx and classical Marxism, that that doesn't reject the progressive role of capital, that doesn't reject the need for that socialism would be unfettering the force of production that are imposed by capital. And so it's really frustrating to see how many people in the Marxist left have been sort of bamboozled by these texts, given the dearth of evidence there. And it really does suggest that either people have not read extensively, or they have read extensively and are just choosing to emphasize these very small tidbits of evidence, which could be also, in any case, could be read in other ways.
Yeah, and I think his main claim that you're pointing out, Derek, is that somehow metabolism became sort of like absolutely central to Marx's political economy as a whole. And that, I think, again, you can look in the notebooks. Marx was clearly interested in the soil and the metabolism and what he framed as the metabolism, but it's clearly not the central category of capital and to his critique of political economy that's focused on value and surplus value and exploitation and accumulation. I mean, as we put it in the piece, it becomes like metabolism all the way down, sort of that becomes the central part of the sort of big shift that Marx makes and towards being an ecological thinker, and it's just not clear it's so central from at least the text. So
purely anachronistic. There's no understanding to anywhere near the extent that we have today of understanding of environmental challenges, environmental problems. You have the limited beginnings of concerns about pollution, the identification of the robbing of the soil from Justus von Liebig is not incorrect with respect to nutrient depletion. But there's already a Marxist response to that if there is a solution to that problem that is profitable, then capitalists will solve that problem. If a resolution of that problem is not profitable or even insufficiently profitable, and this is sort of what Michał Zborski and I put forward in People's Republic of Walmart, and then Brett Christopher's sort of develops much further in his latest work, The Price is Wrong, then they won't develop that. This doesn't just go for environmental challenges. This goes for anything. We could see exactly the same issue with the development of antimicrobial resistance, where antibiotics are no longer as effective as they used to be. And we need to just develop new classes of antibiotic. But because for 40 years, large pharmaceutical companies have largely got out of the business of new research and development and production, deployment of new classes of antibiotic, because it's insufficiently profitable compared to drugs for chronic diseases. They won't produce them, and that's not an environmental problem. That's an issue with pharmaceuticals. And so, problem after problem after problem that humanity faces, Marxism already has an explanation as to why markets are insufficient in solving those problems. We don't need to invent a whole new sort of theory of metabolic rift. It's already there within commodity production.
Mm.
Well, I mean, in some ways, it's a little bit frustrating because in the beginning of Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Saito uses this relatively obscure Japanese school of Marxism to argue that resource exhaustion would be endemic to capital, and I'm like, well, duh. But that would also lead to other pressures that would correct for some of it, although ultimately, there'd be a crisis. But the idea, it doesn't, at least from even from that work, it doesn't actually make sense to me to go from that to one, arguing that we need to throw Engels out of the Marxist canon, which is a very old move, but
Yeah. Yeah, even John Belly Foster really doesn't like that. And
Yeah.
they were his monthly press is the original publishers of Saito.
And Engels, John Bellamy Foster's brought up that Engels's early work on the condition of the working class in England is very ecological. It's very much about like, pestilence and horrible conditions of water and waste. There's an ecological story to be told there.
Just to go back to what you were saying a second ago, Derek, around the resource exhaustion is endemic to capitalism. Duh. I mean, I would disagree with that. I would say that resource exhaustion, if that is profitable, then that is what capital in a particular sector will continue to do. If they can solve that exhaustion, and the solution is profitable, then they will do that. The problem is this understanding that isn't just limited to questions around ecology, but there's a sort of widespread belief on the left that everything that capitalism does is bad, that there can be no progressive role to capitalism. Whereas Marxism says, no, it's not immoral, it's amoral. And so sometimes there will be things that in the course of capitalist production that are absolutely of benefit to humanity, so long as it's profitable. And that is the key. You could encapsulate our entire critique basically of this school of thought with that understanding. The capitalism is this it's Janus faced. It's not purely villainous.
I mean, I think. Sorry.
Good.
I think Leigh and I have had sort of conversations about this. I mean, I think there are parts of capitalism that, like, particularly the anarchy of market allocation, that just like it's just like out of our collective control. I think that is something that makes it very hard to kind of, as we would like to plan our relationship with nature in a very rational way, so that the sort of anarchy of the market's a real big problem. But I also think as Marx said, the kind of like inbred tendency to develop labor productivity, called relative surplus value, sort of constantly improving the labor productivity of technology does perhaps tend towards a certain if you couple that with the necessity of accumulation, you can sort of see there would be a ratcheting up of the material throughput of resource use through these internal dynamics of capitalism. But whether or not that has ecological problems has to do with what the energy inputs are and what the material inputs are and all that kind of stuff. But there are these kind of, again, these sort of anarchic and sort of constantly revolutionizing the labor productivity that could lead to ecological problems. But I think it's, again, it's very amoral. I like that framing as well. So,
and the crucial thing there is not to respond to that problem by degrowing or imposing limits to growth, net aggregate increase in production, but to democratize production, and then leave it up to people ourselves to decide what new production is going to occur, what reduction in production is going to occur. It's just so much more complex a challenge that we face, rather than just that the sort of 1960s, 1970s Neomalthusian limits to growth thesis, which historically, at the time, thankfully, almost uniformly, Marxists were very, very critical of. The unfortunate thing is today that we don't seem to have as many people who should know their Marx taking on these or repeating these sort of neo-Malthusian claims of the 60s and 70s, population bomb and the Limits to Growth Report, Club of Rome, all that it's just a regurgitation of that. And we might want to ask what has changed with the class composition of the left since then that has led to this retreat from a classical Marxist analysis to a sort of, to this Neomalthusian perspective. We've got answers to that question as well, if you want to hear them.
Well, before we get into the specific arguments, what do you think has shifted the class composition of the left?
I think that in the I think we still haven't come to grips fundamentally with how thoroughgoing the neoliberal victory of the 1970s and 1980s over the working class, and crucially working class institutions was. That there was a shattering of the left, the sort of the intellectuals within the left, which had always historically been embedded primarily within trade unions and industrial unions, retreated to academia, to these new forms of enterprise called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and the media. There's nothing wrong per se with being a journalist or an academic. I'm a journalist, Matt's an academic. The problem is when the bulk of the left is built out of that much more middle class. I don't want to use PMC. Derek articulated some fantastic critiques of that terminology, which I completely agree with. But it would be the same as if, for example, all of the left were primarily male, as in in a lot of trade union leadership in the 1950s, 1960s was the case, and it was perfectly fine for men in like feminist men within the trade union movement and the left to say this is a problem. And I think the more professionals like myself and Matt, it's not hypocritical for us to point out like there's the left should be much broader, much more representative of the whole of the class than just this small, more middle class section. As a result of that, there isn't the disciplining force of the bulk of the working class, and intellectuals, their greater flights of fancy are allowed to run freely, and so we come up with crazy things like degrowth communism and abolish the police, abolish prisons, and things like that. I think any time that the sort of industrial labor does respond to these crazier positions of mandatory global veganism and degrowth and only having variable renewable energy like wind and solar, not much more expansive understanding that we need firm clean electricity from nuclear, from geothermal, from hydroelectric, and so on and so forth. That when labor, particularly industrial labor that is literally on the cold face of these energy transport and industrial systems, pushes back against these crazier demands, the response from this middle classy, professional, non-managerial, but sometimes managerial group of people that dominate the left discourse, that the response from that is that these people are just business unionists, as opposed to what they really are, which is people who have a deep both formal and tacit understanding of those industrial systems and how best to decarbonize them, how best to clean them up, and who have the most weight in society to be able to force changes in line with decarbonization and other environmental questions through their ability to withdraw their labor and collective bargaining. Sorry, Matt, what were you going to say there?
Yeah, I mean, and also during precisely this period, we have seen the neoliberalism was an attack on the whole working class, but it was particularly in the global north an attack on the industrial working class. And you have processes of deindustrialization and just complete abandonment of that section of the working class. And that at the same time, you have sort of the rise of the knowledge economy, right? What some call cognitive capitalism, or sort of like the increasing preponderance of highly educated knowledge workers who we now refer to as PMC or whatever. But they were the class of people that was kind of using credentials to kind of carve out advantages in the labor market that's being completely decimated through neoliberal kind of inequality. And so that class of knowledge workers became particularly invested in environmentalism, right? And a lot of environmentalism became about, knowing the science and politics of kind of knowledge around the science of collapse and insofar as like in the 1970s, like the limits to growth report was like the science is saying that we're about to hit these limits. So like all this is converging on this kind of politics that really appeals to a knowledge working class, if you want to put it that way. And what constitutes this class too is that, as Leigh was saying, they're separated materially from production, from like the nitty gritty of not only industrial production but agriculture and energy and the whole kind of material system that you would say is actually causing a lot of these environmental problems, whether it be climate change or another. So from this kind of detached knowledge worker perspective, it became very like obvious to kind of have this very anti-industrial politics, right? That's just, we need to sort of shut down these whole systems and degrow all this stuff. But a lot of times these knowledge workers don't have really sophisticated technical understandings of how these systems of production work, how we could actually transition these systems in production into ways that could both make them more environmentally sound, but also like continue to provision humanity's needs, right? And so you get a lot of these fantasies of kind of, we can just like localize agriculture and everything will be fine, right? Or as Leigh said, we can just like build 100% solar and wind power and it will just be fine. And there's this I think anthropologist named David Hughes who said, we should just align our lives with the intermittency of solar and wind power and allow there should be blackouts just intermittently because we have to solve climate change and that's sort of seen as so there's just like complete detachment from the engineering technical systems of production that, again, Marxism was always about like material production and how the working class is going to seize it. And that's just not the class of knowledge workers that became the protagonists of environmentalism are not embedded in material systems. Yeah. And so their politics is I think distorted for that reason in a lot of ways.
And so this is, just one last, sorry, Garrett, but I just wanted to add very quickly. So this is a critique that I would argue is classical Marxist self-critique based around recognizing there are variations in terms of power and capacity and knowledge and so on and so forth, that there is stratification within the working class, but that stratification is crucially about the relations to the means of production, not wealth. Not the liberal class analysis or class critique, which is that some people are wealthier than other people, and therefore, and this is where we get the sort of like Saito's claim that workers in the global north live, quote, extravagant lifestyles. That this book that's just come out from Verso to, I think, German academics claiming that we're all culpable within the imperial mode of living. Ultimately, these critiques are much more liberal, wealth-based critiques about the stratification within the global working class, rather than a critique based around relations to production.
Well, this actually is related to a question I was going to ask. This kind of politics is not new. We had it in the 60s and 70s with the liberal Paul Ehrlich, which was
100%.
Very nasty, almost explicitly racialist. Then in the 80s and 90s, and a little bit in the early aughts, you had the advent of primitivism, the John Searson world, and at least you could get those guys to admit that their politics required a 99.9% human die-off. That like basically that to return to hunter-gatherer. I mean, Searson goes so far in one essay as to admit you might have to somehow evolutionarily lobotomize humans so they don't have abstract thought anymore, so they don't reinvent technology.
Oh, jeez.
But when I encountered radicalism in the late 90s, early aughts, that was what I encountered first. Was
Yeah.
Daniel Quinn, Derek
Oh my God.
Jensen.
Daniel Quinn and Derek Jensen were like my they were like my entry to politics.
Yeah. I mean, we're of the right age. What
Then
oh my God.
I was an Earth Firster, deep green, all that stuff.
So the question that I have about this is, one of the things that makes degrowth a little different is that it doesn't say we're going to be in absolute primitive conditions, although it's very vague on what we actually need to do. It seemed to throw in some third worldist ideology about divided and uneven development, and like we need to shift development into the periphery, which most Marxists would be like, fine, until you're like, and we need to suppress development in the core, which is bizarre.
Work exactly? How do you have economic development in the South, but none in the North, thus requiring that the South not sell anything to the North and the North not sell anything to the South?
Certainly not bananas. There are no bananas.
Did you follow the no bananas debate?
Yes. Well, I mean, one of the things that this seems to imply is there should be no social labor. Like, yes, we all realize that we live in an imperial system, and the imperial system is an outgrowth of capitalism. I'm not going to do my normal sorry Maoist things, but because they seem to think that it's inverted. But that this accumulation fundamentally benefits everybody. I mean, for example, I've gotten Salvador Ingles de Mora on the show, and we talked about the actual ecology of socialist states. But one of the things we both talked about is that you do have to make trade-offs, and that a lot of these trade-offs are only possible by leapfrogging prior technology. So like China has been able to grow leaps and bounds partly because it doesn't have to reinvent everything that everybody else has already invented in the capitalist world or in the Soviet one. So it just seems like a very strange notion of we're going to freeze this for some people. We're going to somehow keep them not mixing. I guess this also implies nationalism, although Saito doesn't go there.
It's all
I've been trying to figure out, like, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I disagree with you completely. It's just really vague. Like you scratch the surface just a little bit and it just unravels because, well, it would, of course, have to follow that there'd have to be sort of global South autarchy for that to happen. And nobody ever articulates that. But that is the logical consequence of what they're saying. And there are many, many other issues that where there's just, it is true that they're not primitivists like John Zerzan and Deep Green Resistance and so on and so forth. They really aren't. But the logical consequence of Kohei Saito's claim that technology under capitalism, what he calls real subsumption, is inherently infected by capitalist social relations. Therefore, we need to get rid of it, or we can't make use of it. And he says we have to start from scratch. This is where the title came from. Start for our essay. Starts from scratch socialism. And then at other points, he does say, "Oh, but I'm not saying that we need to get rid of everything." Well, because clearly we can make use of some things. Well, but if you can't make use of some things, that completely vitiates this thesis of real subsumption that technology under capitalism is inherently infected with capitalist social relations. So it's just incoherent, and it's just easy to see how incoherent it is.
Yeah. So instead of dealing with the teleology of capitalist technology under mode of production and repurposing that teleology for social production and reproduction, it's just we have to give it up, just throw it away. Except when we don't, maybe.
Yeah.
I think our position has been caricatured by some that we just take the capitalist technology and it's fine and we just use it. But I think the correct term is what you just said, repurpose. Like there's no Marxist theory of history that just starts from scratch and just like burns everything and builds a new world. Like historical materialism is about societies coming out of the material conditions that came before and then repurposing these technologies towards more libertarian ends, right? Because I think it's true that under capitalism, there's a lot of technology that is designed expressly to dominate workers, exploit workers. I mean, Amazon's trying to patent a watch that they make their workers wear that tracks their every move. And, you know, like these are parts of the technology under capitalism. But Marx is very clear that capitalism also has, again, this sort of inherent tendency to develop labor-saving technology that could be repurposed in all sorts of ways to, you know, automate a lot of things and free up time for us and really and obviously we're going to have to make use of all of that. And another thing you just said is social labor, right? And that's to me the main point of Marx's theory of capital actually is that capital socializes labor, right? It makes labor more cooperative and more social. And now we're in 2024, we're actually looking at a process that Marx called the collective worker. He was kind of talking about, you know, like these large scale factories where but now, you know, you talk about global supply chains, the collective worker is a global kind of organism that is really, it's really socialized the production process on a planetary scale, right? And that socialization of production has, as you just said, Derek, like led to so many benefits all across the globe for countless numbers of people. But ultimately the socialization is only the main gains from it are appropriated by the capitalist class who controls that socialization of labor. And what socialists say is that, well, if capital is already socializing production, why don't we socialize control over the production and take social control over it and again repurpose it towards human and social needs, but also trying to solve a lot of these ecological problems that we face.
So before we get into the specifics of the Anthropocene book, I do want to talk about a few moves I've noticed from Saito that I've seen since the new left. One, real subsumption being an out card for whatever you want to say it's going to be an out card for, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, that's a section of, is it Capital Grandressa that was extracted from the text?
Yes. It's the appendix to volume 1 in the Penguin edition.
Right.
He does mention it briefly in the main, I think it's chapter 16 of Capital. But the main sort of articulation of formal to real subsumption is in what's called results of the immediate process of production, which is the appendix of the Penguin edition of volume 1. It was apparently going to be part of volume 1 at some point, and then it got taken out.
I find it interesting how many different groups use this text for different things. Negri used it to argue that we couldn't have political reforms anymore. The communization movement around endnotes used it to argue that we shouldn't worry about the working class at all, which I find very suspect from professors, but nonetheless. But so I'm going to put that on star for a trick I've seen a lot. I shouldn't say a trick, but there are certain kinds of things. The other one, and I actually do think these letters are important, but not in the way that Saito uses them. The Vera Sasulik letters are also used to basically say that whatever you think you don't like about anti-Dühring, and look, there's stuff not to like about anti-Dühring, I'll admit that. You can use the Vera Sasulik letters to go, it's all bad. Marx broke with Engels. And I find it very funny because the reason why we know about the Vera Sasulik letters is Engels. He's why totally. We have them before the Mega 2. They were actually published by him relatively early. But let's see, it's the same reason why we know about the Goethe program as Engels. So, you know, I find it interesting that for completely different reasons that were done in the 70s, Saito is using this, Marx good, Engels bad thing. Now, in the 70s, this was Marx good, Engels bad, Soviet, communism. And that's not what Saito is concerned about, but it's the same move.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same move, actually. With the same text being invoked. Given the amount of work that Saito has done in the mega archives, I have a hard time believing that he doesn't kind of know this.
Mm-hmm.
But I should not impugn motives to someone I have not ever spoke to. So, what do we make of that? And why do we think? Why do we think so many people are trying to put this degrowth stuff into Marxism? Because it's even, as you guys have hinted, but I asked him when he was on my show, it seemed kind of spooked John Bellamy Foster a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Foster was just interviewed in the Monthly Review this month, and he basically comes out and says that there's just no evidence for what Saito is claiming. And again, like I said before, Foster is quite fond of Engels and his ecological contributions to historical materialism. So this Engels move, it's very curious. It's not clear why Saito went that direction, but it's quite extreme. Engels claims that Marx reviewed Anti-Düring and commented on it, even wrote parts of it, I think, is one of the claims. And Saito just says that this isn't credible, that essentially Engels is lying about this. like what is, it's very confusing to me.
I think,
because Anti-Düring is so much against the degrowth communist sort of abandoning historical materialism, like all these ideas that, like if Marx approved of Anti-Düring, it could never be true. So therefore Engels is lying. Sorry.
Oh, no. I was just going to say it is quite frustrating how Saito has responded to our piece. I can't remember which interview it was with him. I think it was
the Atlantic.
Oh, that's right. It was the one in the Atlantic, which goes to show how
that's crazy. That was in the Atlantic.
Yeah, absolutely. Liberals are
dude's blowing up.
Like glowing, very softball puff piece interviews with him and reviews of his work in the New York Times and many other like NPR and stuff. That's a whole other thing about how really threatening is he. But his response to our critique in the Atlantic was that, well, we haven't read what he's read in the Mega, so like we don't know what we're talking about. Well, but we have, and surely every other Marxist in the last 100 years has read a lot of the Marxist canon. And so if there's some super secret stuff that he hasn't told us about yet, beyond what he has shown us, the Zasulich letters and John Bellamy Foster's, a couple of footnotes, tell us, and okay, we'll have to happily admit that, it does turn out to be the case that Marx was some sort of a neo-Malthusian after all, and he did have this sort of radical break in 1867, and he abandoned historical materialism. Please lay it on us.
Well, the other thing I can say is the other Mega 2 scholars, Marcel Musto and Tarcel Carver, have not. And Tarcel Carver is the Mega 2 Engels scholar, have not signed on to these claims, even if they initially endorsed Saito's early work. I've looked for it because I'm like, okay, has Carver said that Saito's right about this claim about Anti-Düring? Because
I need to look at it again, but Saito cites, so this claim I just said before, where Engels is lying about Marx reviewing Anti-Düring and approving of it, that he cites Carver for that claim. And I went to Carver, I looked at it, and I didn't, I have to look at it again. I didn't see any convincing evidence that Carver was able to present that this was a lie. this is Engels just making stuff up. So I don't, I think Carver, am I wrong? Didn't he write a book called like Postmodern Marxism or something? Like, I don't know about that particular claim, but it again, it seems outlandish that why would Ingalls lie about this?
Yeah.
Like,
I don't want to impute any like malevolent motives to Saito and his publishers. I think Saito probably believes that he has developed a new reading of Marx. I would put the greater blame on the fact that over the last 20, 30 years, there has been a tendency within the humanities and on the left, left scholarship more broadly, that to accept that a reading of that, the death of the author, that any particular reading is legitimate. You don't really have to strongly substantiate your claims, and that if anybody does contest the evidence that you've brought to bear, oh well, that's a different reading, or they haven't read what I've read. I mean, I don't want to be like a STEM nerd, but I do think that there are things that are true and there are things that are not true. There are claims that are claims are testable, and this doesn't pass the sniff test.
Well, one of the things that I think that this is unfortunate about is that even beyond, say, the death of the author, which we can get into the Mont and Bailey there, because in one sense, yes, people are not just sole locuses of their own ideas, but in the other sense, it doesn't mean you can reappropriate everything out of context infinitely. I mean, even Umberto Eco complained about that, and he's just a liberal. But I do think we have to look at another, like, one problem I think that you have in scholarship, and I'm going to say all scholarship, because I don't think I've just seen this in Marxism, but I'm going to come back to this with Marxism in a second, is the need for novel claims to make things more publishable.
Yeah.
Like this really does seem to be a problem. Like, that's why I pointed out the Socialist letters and the real subsumption, because those seem to be the areas that you can go to. Maybe also the notes on the machine from the Grundrisse, whatever. There's a couple of clean things that everyone goes to be like, everything you know about Marx is wrong. And it can go in any direction, and that's what's so surprising. It's not just that, it's not just Saito who's using these pieces. Like people use them to go in all kinds of directions.
And is this not potentially beyond just Saito? Isn't this potentially a problem with how the neoliberal revolution, the thoroughgoing victory over even our own institutions such as left-wing publishing houses, left-wing scholarship? You have no choice but to, in the neoliberal academy, but to consistently come up with novelty. That is downstream of the gutting of public funding of universities, of the turning of universities into basically insurance and real estate financial institutions rather than schools. The growth of administrative bloat, the end of the Republic of Letters, scholars no longer truly controlling their departments, the need to publish or perish, and on and on and on and on. I mean, I would not be surprised, and actually I shouldn't say this, no. Mention it later, but like we should know that our left-wing publishing houses are, at the end of the day, capitalist entities. It's great that they exist, but they have to survive. And if it happens to be the case that publishing curious novelties like this, or doom-mongering climate texts that don't actually represent the already scary enough climate science. If when they do that, but is it not possible that they're doing that because that's what sells?
I will also say that I'm an academic and I'm in, like the field of geography and what could be called critical environmental studies more broadly. And I can tell you, I mean, there's nothing hotter in these realms than degrowth right now. I mean, everyone wants to talk about degrowth and linking it to decolonial this and that and linking it to abolition or whatever. But so if you could show that Marx was a degrowth communist, like there is a huge appetite for that in academia right now. And I will say that Saito, particularly in the bestsellers that's translated as Slow Down, he does not do anything new in the degrowth literature. He just appropriates it and represents it very, he does a decent job. He, talks about the planetary boundaries. He kind of does a very Jason Hickel type sort of overview of why we need to degrow, why decoupling doesn't work. Of course, Leigh can give the counter to that, but then the book shifts to, okay, now we're going to Marx and now we're going to show how Marx was a degrowth communist. So I think that is kind of the niche he's filling. Like, look, degrowth is great. Everyone loves it. And look, I can show you that not only does everyone love it, but I found out that Marx himself was a degrowth communist. Therefore, the end of the book can be like, okay, now we're doing degrowth communism. The future is degrowth communism. And of course, when it gets to the end, it's a weird kind of hodgepodge of small scale, pretty anarchist solutions that again have really nothing to do with kind of Marxism. And he talks about like horizontal solidarity, autonomous zones, localizing agriculture. Sounds very much more like of the Occupy era than of a kind of Marxist approach to politics.
It sounds like David Graeber.
Yeah, exactly. It's very anarchist, and there's nothing about the state. There's nothing about unions. And as we say in the piece, there's nothing about the working class or anything about the role of the working class in bringing this degrowth communist future. So, but I think there's a huge appetite for it in academia. I'll say that.
And it is a crying shame. It really is a crying shame because, it was. I think it's 27 years since the Kyoto Protocol. This year. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 28 years.
1997. Yeah.
1997. 27. And
you make me feel old. Thanks. Okay, go ahead.
Me too.
And we are 26. Is that right? 26 years away from 2050, the date at which all countries have pledged to, or most countries have pledged to reach net zero emissions in order to avoid dangerous climate change, either 1.5 degrees by the end of the century or 2 degrees. It was, what was it? 86% of energy production in 1997. Let me make sure I've got this right. 86% of energy production was in 1997 was from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
82% of global energy production is from fossil fuels in 2024. So for fuck's sake, I mean that is pathetic. That is, I mean it's almost a rounding error there. By God, do we need a much more aggressive climate policy? And there's already, as Matt and myself and some of our co-thinkers like Fred Stafford, a few other folks, Paul Prescott, Gail Brooks, have said, markets aren't up to the task. We need much more industrial policy to at a minimum, hopefully extending towards public ownership in many crucial areas. to better coordinate, because markets, markets are just really bad at coordinating the solving of grand tasks that straddle multiple economic sectors. At a bare minimum, we need a seriously muscular social democracy on an almost global level. Like this is, and we've already got a really great analysis as to why it is that we have barely shifted the needle with respect to decarbonization. It's already there within Marxism and its critique of, let's call it, to use sort of contemporary discourse around AI. You know, AI, the great problem with AI is supposed to be in the future, the AI alignment problem. Well, we have a market alignment problem in that humanity doesn't control it. It is completely amoral, anarchic. It is directed by its own incentives. And the solution to this and many other existential threats that we face, from pandemics to antimicrobial resistance, or even things like space debris and near-Earth asteroids, which are really sort of sci-fi kind of stuff. It is democratic control, greater cooperation, ending the, or at least severely constraining that amoral, anarchic market incentive, internationalism, and so on and so forth. Like, it's already there. Why do you need this extra novelty? And it's already. And the other, like, really frustrating thing about this discourse is, our critics are forever saying, we just want basically capitalism to stay the same, except it'll all be publicly owned. My God, like if everything, like all the production was publicly owned, that is like a gargantuan revolutionary transformation. It's almost as if these people think of capitalism not as a set of economic relations, but instead industrial stuff. And they don't like industrial stuff, whether it's privately produced or publicly produced. And we just want something completely different. We don't want this. Like that's AJ Singh Chowdhury's sort of book that, like, he devotes an entire chapter, brothers and sisters, to just me and Matt.
It's like 60 pages too.
60, yes,
it's like crazy.
And his main critique basically comes down to the fact that we just want everything to remain the same except to be socialist. And I was listening to him today on Novara FM, the British far left media empire, which in many respects is very good. Sometimes they do interviews like this where it's vomitous, but and he was saying that basically this argument that, well, I've spoken to so many people and they're so exhausted. They're exhausted of the earth, and they don't even know why. I'm sorry, that's his accent. I should be making fun of his accent. I don't even know why, like, we have the world that we have, and we just want, like, a different world. This is romanticism. This is utopianism. This is exactly the stuff that Engels was raging against in Anti-Düring in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. We're supposed to be hard-headed. We're supposed to be fucking serious, bloody serious, very, very hard-nosed, industrially minded, understanding industrial processes, understanding the key economic relations. And I think that the only people who really have come to grips with what needs to be done in order to solve climate change, nitrogen pollution, biodiversity loss, and so on and so forth, are those of us in this school of, I mean, sometimes it's called left eco-modernism. I just think it's like plain vanilla socialism, that is very bloody serious about industrial policy, at a minimum, about public ownership, about vertically integrated utilities, about the power of labor, crucially industrial labor, about a just transition, the technologies that we still need to invent for things like decarbonizing cement. We don't know how to decarbonize cement, or well, about 85% of cement use cases. It's really hard to decarbonize steel. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Like, it's really hard to decarbonize aluminum, or as we say in the Commonwealth, aluminium. And all of this stuff, if it isn't profitable for it to be done, it will not be done. We desperately need better innovation policy, industrial policy, research and development, de-risking of technology. We need even for those technologies that already we know that they work and are clean. In many cases, they're far too expensive for many countries in the developing world to purchase, to use, to deploy. They need to be a lot cheaper. How are we going to make them cheaper? We need better innovation. Again, the capitalist class will not, if they can't make any money of that, they won't do it. So all of this really does, as I said, I don't want to repeat myself. There's already lots of stuff that needs to be done desperately. There's a great analysis that we have. There are people who articulate it. Let's be doing a lot more of that stuff instead of these ridiculous debates about, like, get with the program. Sorry.
This does lead me to ask a question that I think is going to maybe make a lot of my listeners a little bit uncomfortable. And that is the pairing of very milquetoast demands and dreams with radically impossible ones. And I'll give you an example, like on abolishing police and abolishing prisons. I am not necessarily a police abolitionist. I am actually kind of a prison abolitionist because I used to work in one. But those are massive social infrastructure changes. All right. And if you were to say abolish the police, what you'd have to classically replace them with in the 19th century was a universal militia where everyone's basically the police. Everybody's basically the police. And it is kind of like I might even frame it to liberals like, yeah, it's community policing on crack. You'll
just have private militias, and can working class people in working class communities afford decent what is the cooperative police militia going to look like compared to the private militias that the billionaire class can and is already affording and is already implementing in the face of under policing? I agree with prison abolition. This is another great, not to go off on a tangent here, but okay, I'll go on a tangent. If we're I'm very sympathetic to a sort of long range conception of something along those lines, where we I don't think we'll ever get rid of prisons, but I think we can definitely asymptote towards something close to that. And where in the world already do we see that sort of thing? Has that already begun to happen, at least to some degree? I don't want to, it's a cliche to sing the praises of Scandinavia. I mean, it absolutely has its own problems. And Sweden has been gripped with like terrible crime in recent years for all sorts of different complicated reasons. But until relatively recently, if you look at the countries that have been doing the best in terms of elimination or reduction of police brutality, of even closing prisons because there just aren't enough people to fill the prisons, it is those more muscular social democratic countries with greater levels of state intervention, much more generous welfare provision. Again, as we know, it's all there's been cuts there as well. So and regulations where there are psychological profiles of police to exclude people who are particularly have tendencies towards violence, might have psychological problems that suggest that they're really not very well suited to this. You have to have a lot more education to be able to, and training to become a police officer and a prison officer and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I know people are just going to listen to this and say, oh, he's just a fucking social democrat. Well, I'm sorry, but I really do believe that there is no distinction between socialism and social democracy. That the process of communization is much more akin to the Reformation than it is to the French Revolution. It will inevitably. It is. What do we have to do? Is steadily build institutions of working class power and democracy over time. It is a multi-generational project. Social democracy, muscular social democracy, not the social democrats of Tony Blair and so on and so forth that we see these days, but seriously constructing those socialist institutions over time.
Well, this gets us to the problem of radical chic, though, because, I mean, part of my point in bringing this up, and I don't disagree with everything you just said there. I think you and I have had these discussions about how radical the change might need to be, and we'd agreed and disagreed on elements of it in the past. But one thing I would say is that I think about the demands after the Floyd uprising, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, and what people got 2 years out. Like, so demands were first abolish the police, which was immediately retranslated to defund the police. And then people should be very careful because this Mountain Bailey thing goes both ways, right? Like there's both like the I'm presenting the moderate thing, but I have this radical thing that seems cool, and then I go back and forth. But there's also I'm presenting the thing that sounds radical, but it's really I'm hiding in it this thing that's going to do nothing, right? Like, so defunding the police, I've always said, is like, well, that's, I mean, one, taking away just from the, not even dealing with the logistics of crime, the idea that you're going to take away money from the people with the most guns and just leave them alone seems to be a little bit of a bad idea. But beyond that,
well, to tie it back to sort of climate and environmental questions, the irony is that they're just not very radical in some of their demands. Like at the end of Slow Down, as Matt was saying, okay, so what does this really look like? So, like, practically, what are the policies? How do we gather what
50% of the population works in agriculture or something? Like
it's like local co-ops. It's a 4-day work week. It's more buses. Everybody should bike everywhere. It's like, really? That's it? I mean, you're there's no sort of it sounds super radical. But actually, it's a bit of a nothing burger. I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to a 4-day work week. I think it's a lovely idea that every society should constantly promise its people that as the forces of production develop, hopefully every generation we will be able to make the work week shorter. I mean, I just think that's maybe even put something like that in the Constitution. It's great. Why not? I don't know how, or like ending planned obsolescence. I mean, I think it's a dick move on the part of Apple that I can't fix things directly, and that they have a proprietary screwdriver, so that like even third-party engineers can't like technicians can't pull it apart and put in a new battery and stuff like that. I think that's all bullshit, but that's not where the bulk of emissions are coming from. So the ambition is just really, really low. The bulk of emissions comes not from fast fashion or planned obsolescence or the fact that we have a 5-day work week rather than the 4-day work week. It's a fact that it comes from, vast majority of it comes from vitally socially necessary production, like housing, like building schools, like electricity, like transport. It's
steel and cement. Yeah,
it's steel and cement. So it doesn't even come to grips with the scale of the challenge that we face. It doesn't touch and makes you wonder: have they even read the annual sort of spreadsheets of emissions? Emissions outputs for national inventories. That's the word. The national emissions inventories that every country has to submit to the UNFCCC. Because if you read that, you're like, well, this is clearly these solutions around planned obsolescence and less packaging are going to do nothing. If anything, on less packaging, you would massively increase food waste, which is one of the largest sources of emissions within the agricultural sector. So some of them are just like completely counterproductive anyway.
But
My point
here
being it's just crap. Sorry.
We've come full circle, because you see how this appeals though to a middle class person that's anxious about their consumption, and the packaging and the fast fashion, and and the fact that people drive SUV. I mean, middle class people are constantly anxious and guilty about the consumptive world they're surrounded by, and therefore, if your program is to scale down all that, it really appeals to that middle class. But it, as you said, like, it has nothing to do with the real decarbonization challenge, which is more towards, I use this in my book, that what Marx called the hidden abode of production. Like, it is steel, cement, chemicals, like these really industrial processes that are at the core of it, electricity being the core one as well. But again, like, fundamentally, where Saito ends his sort of degrowth communist future is this vision of radical abundance, which I think I share, which is that communism is really about free time for not just like individuals to develop ourselves, but also like, just for, like leisure and collective effervescence or whatever. Like, that's right there in Marx. It is in the Grundrisse, where he talks about disposable time, and it is in volume 3 when he talks about the realm of freedom. But what Saito misses is that Marx is very clear that, like, to make that realm of freedom and abundance possible, you need such a hyper efficient, socialized production system that can really create the material conditions for freedom for all, right? Because if you just have everyone working on farms and stuff, most people are going to be working very long days. And if you want to create free time for some, you can in society, and certain people with privilege can like do slow food and like spend all their time hanging out and cooking. But like, if you want abundance for all and free time for all, you need like really massively efficient, large scale production systems that capitalism is particularly good at developing, and that we could repurpose towards that end, I think.
Well, free time and consumptive goods are class experiences. I mean, there's almost a rent on them. I mean, and I think about this, about like aspirational trad wife TikTok, because I live in Utah. There's a lot of it here. And I'm not saying that degrowth communism is exactly that, but when I'm like, if you want to spend a month and a half to make a sandwich because you're trying to produce it all within a small family subsistence farm, go ahead, I guess. But most people can't do that. And I think it's interesting that Saito's actual suggestions are so milquetoast, because the other degrowth bones, like half of communism and stuff like that, aren't as milquetoast, but they're clearly not possible. So
their global mandatory veganism that's in the Half-Earth Socialism book.
And also like 100% renewables plus biofuels.
Much more seriously,
Land intensive energy is what they're into.
Again, this, absolutely. Again, this really underscores how counterproductive this is. These people are always accusing us of carbon tunnel syndrome, that we only focus on climate change. No, we don't. We talk about land use, biodiversity loss, nitrogen pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're going to have this much more sort of like organic food production, and you're abandoning industrial agriculture, necessarily your yields will go down, which means that your the land use footprint is going to be enormous, massively increased. And again, the biggest cause of biodiversity loss, bar none, not hunting, not overfishing, it's land use change for crop production.
Yeah, well,
So-
when I see that, I'm like, why aren't this is me being the elephant in the room guy again, but like I was like, well, at least the primitives admit that you're gonna have to have a mice population die
Yeah.
off, but you're saying we're not gonna have that. So
Mhm.
are we gonna strip all the world's forests to have enough arable land to do this? Because that's what it sounds like.
Yeah,
Mhm.
the primitivists are at least coherent. They're 100% coherent. They're mad, but they're coherent.
Mad in the crazy sense, right?
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
Both usually,
crazy.
but yeah.
They're also very angry, I think.
They're mad in both senses. Going back to this question around sort of middle class, why this appeals so much to sort of middle class guilt, and why it is so alienating, so rebarbative to the vast bulk of the working class. Like how many days a week do we hear Bernie Sanders trot out that 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck? I don't know if the figure is exactly correct, but he's broadly not wrong. And so if 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and you say, well, don't worry, in the radical abundance that we promise of a 4-day work week, it's going to be great. And it's like, and they'll, I could already have a 4-day work week. I would just earn less. And it's, okay. So it's a 4-day work week with no loss of pay. Okay. I don't disagree. I think that's a grand ambition. But then surely if you have extra free time, but a lot more money for that, you're going to be buying more things with those wages. Isn't that more production? And therefore, so long as you don't absolutely decouple as from greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to be increasing emissions. So one, it doesn't make any sense, but two, it's just very, very rebarbative because most people do not feel that they are living, again, as Saito says, living an extravagant lifestyle, or that they're living in the imperial mode of living, that they need to consume less. The vast majority of ordinary people desperately want to be able to consume a lot more. My God, I know I do. I'm a fucking journalist. I don't earn much money. We all know the crisis of journalism. How our incomes have been declined, and how many of us are being laid off. I would desperately, I make this sort of joke in my first book about how when I was at university, and Naomi Klein's No Logo inspired a bunch of anarchists to go around with these leaflets telling everybody on the day after Black Friday, or after Thanksgiving, which we have a different Thanksgiving in Canada, but whatever. And they called it like Buy Nothing Day.
Yeah.
And I was maxed out on student loans. My parents didn't have any cash to lend me. There were many times where I had to get food from food banks. I wanted desperately for there to be finally able to buy a lot more days, not buy nothing days. And that's how most people feel in the American economy, in the Canadian economy, the British economy, the French economy. It is no wonder that these people are just not winning any votes amongst. I mean, the European elections on Sunday, huge collapse in the vote for Green parties, massive swinging to the far right, including amongst young people, and it is such a shame because there is a really great left-green response that could be happening, which talks about real abundance, not this fantastical abundance of a 4-day work week, but like good, high-paying, community-supporting, family-supporting union jobs in at nuclear power plants, at geothermal power plants, offshore wind, and explaining why it is that that capitalism doesn't do a good job of developing offshore wind. Matt and Fred Stafford just had a fantastic piece in Damage magazine on some of these issues. Like I wish that there were a large group, political parties they were able to put forth that sort of muscular social democracy, that strong trade unionism, that just transition that takes all of these environmental issues seriously. The closest we ever got to that was the Green New Deal sort of program of Bernie Sanders. But again, that to some extent that was watered down with the addition of all sorts of very strange, not PMC, but middle class NGO sort of addenda to it, like we're going to ban aviation and burgers. It's so necessary, and it could happen, but it's just not being done. I just don't see it anywhere, other than that brief moment. I'm cautiously optimistic about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and associated pivots towards industrial policy. I think the left should lean into that. It doesn't go anywhere near far enough, but it is a significant break with neoliberal business as usual, thinking that just carbon pricing market mechanisms are the way to go. It is state intervention. What we should be doing is we should say this doesn't go far enough. We need protection of vertically integrated utilities. We need where the Overton window is a little bit further to the left in places like Canada, where we already have lots of public ownership of the electricity sector. So, well, it should be we should have more public ownership, and just a very serious strategic program that is adapted to whatever locale, depending on the balance of forces in that particular locale.
I do think that there's a strategic thing that we could be taking away from this, which is amping up public ownership and public demands and regulating that out to the various communities. But integrating them not just nationally but transnationally. I mean, one of the weird things right now is both the return to nationalism and to localism, both the left and the right, at a time where, not just for ecological reasons, but ecological reasons are one of the biggest, that's not a really viable strategy. It's not a good strategy for production. No modern economy can perform autochtonously anymore, if they ever could, but they definitely can't now.
100%.
It just seems to me to be a total pipe dream, and and I think you guys are kind of right to point this out, a little bit of an abandonment of internationalism.
Absolutely. Look at again, this is the same sort of abandonment of responsibility, this absent without leave with respect to true internationalism. Where, like just a few days ago, negotiations over a global pandemic treaty that would at least we're supposed to be developing mechanisms so that if we have another pandemic, we aren't stuck with the same situation of vaccine apartheid that we did in the last pandemic, where the global north got access to vaccines and the global south, well, fuck you. Also to develop sufficient international support, like financial support, to allow for early warning systems, to be mechanisms of sharing of data, building up of clinics so that as part of that warning system, so that there can be very rapid reporting into a central locale to know when it seems like something new is spilling over. All this stuff that would probably cost, Bill Gates, whatever, he's estimated cost the global economy about $50 billion a year. It's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. It's pennies. We could do this. And it was defeated on the background, it seems like it's defeated. We'll see how things proceed. On the basis of our own economies in the West, particularly Canada, the United States, Switzerland, the EU as a whole, Britain and France, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Japan, all the countries with very large pharmaceutical sectors, they all defeated it because it requires an overturning, or at least a significant reversal or reform of intellectual property law. And it doesn't just undermine profitability with respect to it undermines profitability with respect to everything they do. It's their whole business model. You can't have that. where was the global protest, the Greta Thunbergs, the Extinction Rebellions protesting outside the UN negotiations around that? Where's been international organizing around that? Something on the order of 20 million people die, excess deaths, depending on whether you're looking at the Economist or the World Health Organization's numbers. Something on the order of about 20 million excess deaths during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we got off lightly because this was just, it wasn't the big one. It wasn't the big bird flu that was that we're expecting with the high mortality rate that we've been sort of dreading for decades. That is far more than the WHO estimated 250,000 who would die every year between the 2030s and 2050s as a result of climate change. And 20 million, and it's going to be a lot worse next time, versus a few 100,000 every year for from climate change. I don't want to undermine the severity and seriousness of climate change. It is serious, but pandemics are like, what is that? Like 3 orders of magnitude greater. Where is the international left on that? Where's the movement? Complete abandonment of responsibility as a result of this.
I suspect they don't know about it.
Localism to municipal nonsense.
Oh yeah,
small is beautiful.
And that there's another, key part of the, if you're gonna focus on an international climate agenda. The degrowth people are so sort of obsessed with this idea that like the global north is exploiting the global south, and it's really all about reducing what the global north is doing. And then but meanwhile, the global south is many parts of it just don't even have modern sanitation infrastructure, don't have access to electricity. Over 100 years ago, Lenin talked about communism as electrification of the whole. Could you imagine Lenin looking today and being like, wait, we still haven't electrified fucking humanity? Like, how scandalous is that from a Marxist perspective? And so there really is not
so much global warming should be so much worse if we had actually electrified the world.
Well,
under global socialism. But that would have been a good situation to have, ironically, because then it would mean that there's hospitals in every locale in the world. There's electricity everywhere.
But now we have the opportunity to, we have this global crisis of climate change that centrally involves electricity. And, if we can use this kind of muscular social democracy to force publicly owned solutions to actually like come out into the market, then there could be a way in which the global internationalist climate agenda could be about decarbonization, but also electrification of the world and many impoverished people that need access to electricity. But I think in general, like there's a problem on the left where everyone just wants to think about single issue movements. Like there's the climate movement and it's doing its thing, right? But I don't think we're gonna move the needle much unless there's just a broad-based kind of anti-austerity movement that does focus on public goods. Like we're just gonna invest in public goods and because that's what the neoliberal period has been about. It's been about austerity and disinvestment in the kind of public sector, and there has to be a broad-based attack on that regime of capitalism, and it has to focus on all sorts of things like healthcare and education, like that have nothing to do with climate. But it's very easy to like bring in climate aspects to that kind of broad-based anti-austerity, public infrastructure, public investment agenda that could not only solve issues in the global north, but again, like that's what that's what the global South has faced as well, with like structural adjustment and the Washington Consensus and all this stuff. Like, we just need to kind of focus on that kind of broad-based agenda, and I think that would be more effective than trying to thinking like we're going to build a climate movement that's going to like, throw paint at throw blood on paintings, or like do all sorts of disruption and kind of create a climate revolution. But like, no, it's got to be much more broader than climate, I think.
Absolutely. If we've got, as they repeatedly, exaggeratedly say, we have just 10 years left to save the planet. Is it more likely to achieve global degrowth communism in 10 years, or more likely that we achieve some level of revival of muscular social democracy and strong trade unions and industrial policy? It's the latter is definitely still a big ask, but it's a lot more realistic to expect that we could go further down that road in the next 10 years than, as they say, global communist degrowth revolution.
Yes, I think that's a good point to end. Thank you, Leigh and Matt. I will link the now somewhat infamous Jacobin article in the show notes. If you haven't read it, you can find it there.
Others have said it was searing.
Anything you two would like to plug on the way out?
You already did it. Damage Magazine has a lot of good stuff coming out.
I don't have anything big coming out soon because I've just been focusing on my thesis, finishing my degree. But knock on wood, going through the hopefully final edits on a piece which will, I think, rustle some jimmies, defending anthropocentrism soon. So
yeah, that will rustle some jimmies. All right. Well, on that note, be looking for Leigh to cause controversy. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Eric.